The following episode contains disturbing material that might be inappropriate for some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised.
In tonight's episode of Real Twisted Tales,
I am going to tell you the story of Katherine Knight, who, due to the nature of her crimes, was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, making her the first and only woman in Australian history to be given that sentence. But before I tell you this tale though, I must say, what happened in this crime, what Katherine Knight did in the March of the year 2000, is possibly the most horrific thing I have ever discovered. Consider yourself warned. Katherine Knight was born in 1955 and lived in a small town called Aberdeen in New South Wales, Australia. It was a small and close-knit community that centred around its main source of income and revenue, an abattoir. Katherine's entire family worked there, as did the friends and family of everyone she knew, and when she was old enough, she left school and took a job working her way into a role on the kill floor. As part of her job, as with any manual job, she needed tools for her trade, and Katherine's tools were no ordinary things. To do her job, Katherine had a set of knives for killing, cutting, and skinning the carcasses of cows that came through. Now to me, this sounds like the worst job on earth, but not to Katherine. She relished in her role, she loved what she did, and even then there were signs of her true personality coming through. This ordinary looking woman, and I mean look at her, she looks like a woman who could be someone you might meet at church. This ordinary woman was in fact hiding her evil in plain sight. Her job was to, as humanely as she could, slaughter the animals that came through. But it's been said that she would sometimes cut the animals just to hear their cries. Sometimes she would nick their arteries just to watch them bleed. And those she worked with saw she enjoyed the fear she created with her actions. And nobody said a thing. But what they didn't know is that Katherine was learning her trade, which would one day move on from killing an animal to killing a person, her partner, John Charles Thomas Price, in the worst way I have ever read. Katherine Knight and John Price met in 1995. He was a kind man, a loving father to 3 children, and when he and Katherine met, she fell in love with a man who showed kindness to her. She came from a failed marriage, where she no longer saw her own child, and the idea of having a family once more made her feel complete. I mean, it sounds lovely, doesn't it? A woman finding love again, finding her family again. But really, Katherine didn't see her own child because of her abusive nature to her ex-husband. He tried to make their marriage work, but the domestic violence aimed at him became too much, and it left him no choice but to leave. But of course, John Price didn't know any of this. The couple were happy for a few years before the cracks began to form, and Katherine's cruel ways began to surface. And it culminated in a row one night in February 2000, where during the heated argument, Katherine actually slashed across John Price's chest with a knife, making him bleed. Price knew in that moment that enough was enough, and he kicked Katherine out of his house and told her he never wanted to see her again. She agreed and moved into a small and dingy apartment. And although John Price felt that it was over and he could move on with his life, Katherine wasn't thinking the same. And she was planning on how she could make him pay for leaving her. Because if she couldn't have him, then no one would. After weeks of planning, Katherine Knight returned to her ex-partner's address, and having previously arranged a childminder to look after his children, she sent them away for the night. When John returned from work and realised she had dismissed his children from his home without his consent, he flew into a rage. However, that rage was short-lived, for when he calmed down, Knight began to put on her charm, and she seduced him. After the couple had sex, John Price fell into a comfortable and deep sleep. And careful not to wake him, Katherine Knight slipped out of the bed, went into the kitchen and grabbed her work knives that she had hidden in the house, waiting for this exact moment. And what happened next is so horrific that even I couldn't have dreamt it up for one of my books. And I must stress again, if you imagine the worst murder ever, you wouldn't even be close to what Katherine Knight did that evening. The next day, John Price didn't turn up for work, and being a man who hadn't taken a sick day from his job as a miner in several years, naturally, his colleagues were concerned. They tried to call him, but when he didn't respond, one of them went to his house. Price's car was still on the drive, the curtains were still closed. It looked like he had simply overslept. However, as his colleague approached the front door and knocked to wake him, he saw blood on the doorframe. He banged several times, calling for him, "Pricey! Pricey!" And with no answer, he rang the police. Within minutes, local detective and lead investigator Bob Wells arrived at Price's house. Wells was a decorated and long-serving officer, an officer who had seen everything in his career. But what he saw that day caused him to have a nervous breakdown. And 20 years later, he is still haunted by Katherine Knight's crime. Before entering the house, Officer Wells saw the blood. He also noticed a dinner plate that was on the lawn, upside down, the food collecting flies in the morning sun. He dismissed it and opened the door. Officer Wells saw a trail of blood that led from the front door back towards the rear of the house, and with his gun drawn, he began to slowly and carefully walk towards it. He didn't dare call out, in case the murderer, as at this point he was confident it was a murder, was still somewhere inside. He walked up a long and cool corridor, his gun pointing in front of him, and as he passed the doorway to the dining room, he looked inside. On the table were several meals, laid out perfectly, and in front of each meal, a name tag. It seemed out of place, but Wells realised that whatever had happened did so at dinner time, just as it was being served the night before. And with a timeline forming in his head, Wells continued along the blood-stained floor and into the back bedroom. Hanging inside the door was a bedsheet, and he swiped it to one side as he continued to advance. He noticed his arm felt damp, and looking, he saw blood. And knowing it wasn't his, he turned back to what he thought was a bedsheet and realised what it truly was. Staggering back, he bumped into a wardrobe, the place the blood trail had led, and opening the door, Wells, the seasoned police officer, nearly vomited. Inside were parts of a human, not a whole human, but bits of an arm, leg, torso, a foot. In shock, Wells staggered past the hanging skin that he said resembled a wetsuit and into the kitchen, and despite what he had just discovered, he was determined to be vigilant and finish his work, and so began to search for more evidence to what had happened. On the stove, he could hear the gentle simmering of boiling water, and looking that way, he saw a large saucepan. Approaching, he tentatively lifted the lid, and even with all he had seen, inside was something he couldn't ever recover from. Simmering in the water, looking directly at him, was the head of John Price. Wells couldn't take it anymore, and as the shock took over, colleagues joined him, their faces mirroring his own. But they all knew they had to finish the job, and so continued to search the house. In the dining room, it was noticed that the food that had been laid out, it looked wrong. And on closer inspection, they discovered that the meat was in fact human. Katherine Knight had killed, skinned, boiled and baked her partner. And the name cards I mentioned, there was one meal for each of his 3 children. But it gets worse. The plate on the lawn I said Wells had seen, that plate was Katherine's, and some of the meal had been eaten before she felt sick and threw the rest out of the window. Katherine Knight was arrested and charged with murder, pleading insanity, and she almost got away with it too, if it wasn't for her own cousin who testified against her. For when planning her crime, her revenge, she told her cousin she was going to kill John Price in such a way they would think she had to be insane. They conducted their tests to see if she was truly insane and discovered Katherine Knight was of sound body and mind when she did what she did to John Price, and that fact surely makes her one of the most evil people in the world. Katherine Knight will spend the rest of her life in prison, and even though she will never get out, knowing someone like that is alive on this earth is truly terrifying. Hi everyone, thanks for watching our video, The Calculating Kill of Katherine Knight. If you enjoyed it and you want to see more, then don't forget to subscribe and you'll be notified when we upload a new story. Also, please consider leaving a comment below as we'd love to know your thoughts. Good night and keep safe.
Coming up in the next episode of Real Twisted Tales,
we will be examining a historical case of 6-year-old Ricky Neve, who in 1994 was murdered, and his killer was only recently brought to justice because of Weetabix.